Let's speak to Martin Plaut, an Africa analyst with the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in London. Welcome to the programme, Martin. You may not care to remember how long ago it was, but when you were a journalist covering the Janjaweed, how easy was it to establish whether the foot soldiers of the Janjaweed were going rogue or were specifically following orders from their commanders in terms of the human rights abuses they're supposed to have committed?
Well, that's an extremely good question, and not one that one can easily answer definitively. I think that what we saw, and I remember being in on the border with Chad and Sudan in the region, seeing thousands of frankly Africans pouring across the border into and trying to scrape a living on sand dunes. It was appalling. The Janjaweed were the very worst, up there with the Lord's Resistance Army as some of the worst rebels I've ever come across in Africa. But how they were controlled, one has to go through a very complex process to work back to come up with someone like Hemeti, who was one of the leaders. In a sense, he relied on the Rashaida group, which is the ethnic group that he comes from, which spans the Chad-Sudan border. And that was really his base.
How have the Janjaweed's other commanders been able to escape justice?
Well, because there's been such chaos in Sudan for so many decades. Your report did an excellent job in trying to show the complexity of that. But it really now comes down to a fight to the finish between al-Burhan, who stands for the center of Sudan, and Hemeti, who stands for the region along the border with Chad, the far west. And these two men are now fighting to the finish. It's absolutely clear that there's no love lost between them. But how this will play out and how the regional players will get involved is very complicated.
What happened 20 or so years ago, how does it correlate with what's happening now? In other words, why the allegations, the accusations of war crimes being committed by the RSF paramilitary now, which the UN says is akin to a genocide in Darfur, how do they equate the two issues with what happened decades ago and now?
Well, there's been this tension between, in a sense, two major tensions in Sudan. One is between the Arab population, the African population, which was partially resolved by the independence of South Sudan from Sudan. That got rid of a lot of it, but there's still large pockets of Africans who live in the north. And that means that there is this issue between them. The second one is and that is the more difficult one, it's the one between Burhan and Hemeti, is between people who live along the Nile and people who live in the periphery, either on the border with Ethiopians and Eritrea, and the people who live along the border with places like Chad. And they represent those two different forces.
Martin, have you heard these rumors or lines coming out of the country that possibly Burhan, the head of the army, wants to relocate the capital from Khartoum to Port Sudan? Because if that were to be true, would it indicate that Burhan is losing control of the capital? If he does, and now I'm asking you 4 questions all in one sentence, if he does lose control of Khartoum, does he lose that conflict?
I would be surprised if he moved to Port Sudan. Anything's possible. Capitals have been moved in the past. Other nations have done it. But really, I wonder if he's going to lose it. What's so interesting is that Burhan himself managed to get out of the army command post 4 days ago. It was the command center in Khartoum in a very complicated strategy, because he'd been under siege for a long time by the RSF. And that does indicate the strength that the RSF and Hemeti does have in the capital. He now is in a position where he can go to places like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and get more political support and surely money and weapons. It was one of the key things that Hemeti has been able to use to win over people to come to fight for him is simply money. And that has been partly because the gold that he has control of through the mines that he has been shipped out through Libya and through the Wagner Group to Russia. So there's been a flow of money from Russia through that gold into Libya, into Hemeti, through the Libyans. And that is how he has funded it. And that's how he's won, by paying people.
Martin Plaut, we always appreciate your analysis. Thanks so much indeed, Martin. Take care.